April 1945. In the heart of East Prussia, a 700-year-old city is preparing to die. Königsberg is not a village or a frontier post. It is the birthplace of Immanuel Kant, the seat of a university founded in 1544, the symbol of Prussian power since the Teutonic Knights built their first castle by the Pregel River in 1255. By April 1945, it is also something simpler and more terrible. A fortress surrounded, with more than 100,000 German soldiers inside and a Soviet army of several 100,000 determined to crush it in a matter of days. When the assault is over, the city that gave its name to one of the philosophical capitals of Europe will have ceased to exist under that name. From its ruins, Kaliningrad will be born, and the million Germans who had lived in East Prussia for generations will have begun the most brutal exodus in its history. This is the story of those final months, told from Soviet military archives, German command records, and testimonies that survived the fire. East Prussia was unlike the rest of Germany. It was a strip of land separated from the main body of the Reich by the so-called Polish Corridor, a region of glacial lakes, pine forests, and farmlands that for centuries had been a frontier, battlefield, and bridge between worlds. The Teutonic Knights conquered it in the 13th century to Christianize the Baltic tribes that inhabited it. From that conquest was born the Duchy of Prussia, and from that duchy, over time, the kingdom that would end up unifying Germany under the House of Hohenzollern. Königsberg was his spiritual capital from the beginning. Founded in 1255 and named after King Ottokar II of Bohemia, it grew up next to the mouth of the Pregel River in a natural harbour that connected it to the Baltic Sea. By the 19th century, it was one of the great university cities of Central Europe, with a population of around 300,000 inhabitants on the eve of the Second World War. It had a royal castle, a red-brick Gothic cathedral built in the 14th century, and an old town of narrow streets that combined medieval architecture with 19th century Prussian urbanism. In 1939, the entire region lived on an agricultural and livestock economy dotted with small industries. It was not a wealthy area compared to the Ruhr or Saxony, but it had something that the rest of Germany valued as a symbol. It was the historic cradle of Prussian militarism, the land of the Junkers, the landed aristocracy that had produced generations of officers for the German army. For Hitler, losing East Prussia was not just losing territory. It was to lose the very origin of the power it claimed to represent. Until 1944, Königsberg experienced the war from a distance. German troops fought in the east, in the west, in North Africa, in Italy, but the city continued to function with the routine of a first-rate university and commercial centre. The Albertina, the university founded by Duke Albert of Prussia in 1544, and which by the 17th century was attracting students from all over Protestant Europe, continued to teach in its faculties of theology, philosophy, and medicine. The cafes in the centre remained open. The zoo, established in 1896 and known to be one of the most comprehensive in East Germany, continued to welcome families on Sundays. The city had electric trams, a port system on the Pregel River directly connected to the Baltic Sea via the Sea Canal built between 1890 and 1901, and a port infrastructure that processed millions of tons of goods annually before the war altered trade routes. The population of Königsberg reached approximately 360,000 inhabitants in 1939, distributed in an urban area that had expanded considerably during the interwar period through the incorporation of peripheral municipalities. It was a middle and upper-class educated city, with a university tradition that went back 400 years, and that had produced, in addition to Kant, figures such as the astronomer Friedrich Bessel, who from the city's observatory calculated for the first time in 1838 the distance to a star beyond the solar system. The mathematician David Hilbert had been born nearby in Wehlau in 1862 and had studied at the Albertina before becoming one of the most influential mathematicians in history. That intellectual tradition was not an ornament. It was part of the identity with which the city thought of itself, differentiated from the rest of East Prussia by its urban and academic vocation. The city had given the world names that transcended Prussia. Immanuel Kant, who was born on April 22, 1724 in the Fordhof neighbourhood, the son of an immigrant saddler of Scottish origin named Johann Georg Kant, lived and died in Königsberg without ever leaving it, with the exception of his years as a rural tutor in the outskirts of the city. He is buried next to the north wall of the cathedral under a simple tombstone that his fellow citizens cared for generations, and which became, over time, one of the most visited places of intellectual pilgrimage in Northern Europe. The composer E.T.A. Hoffmann, born in Königsberg in 1776 and known as much for his fantastic tales as for his opera Undine, was part of the same cultural tradition that made the city more than just an administrative and military centre. The artist Käthe Kollwitz, born in 1867 in the city itself, had spent her adult life in Berlin, but her engravings of the mourning of German mothers who lost children in the First World War had become icons that the city itself recognised as its own. That illusion of distance from the war was shattered on 2 nights in August 1944. The British Royal Air Force launched 2 massive bombing raids on the historic centre of Königsberg on 26 and 29 August, involving more than 174 aircraft in the first raid and a similar number in the second. The result was devastating for the medieval old town. The royal castle, whose oldest construction dated back to the 13th century and which had hosted the coronation of the first king of Prussia in 1701, was severely damaged and almost completely lost its interiors. The 14th century Gothic cathedral where Kant's tomb stood suffered severe structural damage. Tens of thousands of citizens lost their homes in 2 nights. According to German records, the 2 attacks killed several thousand civilians and destroyed between 30 and 40% of the building stock in the historic centre, turning much of the medieval streets into fields of rubble that were still uncleared when the Soviet assault came months later. It was those bombings that pushed the first wave of voluntary evacuation of middle-class families with the resources to move west. Those who had relatives inside Germany, the financial means to pay for the trip, or the keen enough to read between the lines of the war reports, began to leave in the autumn of 1944. Those who stayed, whether because of roots, lack of resources, faith in official propaganda, or the tacit prohibition of the local authorities to speak openly of evacuation so as not to damage morale, would find themselves trapped months later in a city that the regime had turned into a fortress and from which there was no longer an orderly exit. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army had recaptured virtually all of the Soviet territory occupied by Germany since June 1941. Operation Bagration, launched on June 23rd of that year against the German Army Group Center, had destroyed in a matter of weeks the largest grouping of ground forces that Germany maintained on the Eastern Front, eliminating 28 of the 34 German divisions involved and causing around 500,000 casualties among deaths, wounded and prisoners. It was the greatest military defeat in German history, more serious in terms of losses than Stalingrad, and opened a hole in the Eastern Front several hundred kilometers wide, through which the Red Army began to advance into Eastern Europe at a speed that left the German High Command without the capacity for organized reaction. By October 1944, the fallout from that advance had reached the East Prussian border. The Third Belarusian Front, under the command of General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, one of the youngest front commanders in the Red Army, barely 37 years old at the time of the offensive on East Prussia, had brought its forces to the vicinity of the town of Gumbinnen, about 80 kilometers east of Königsberg. It was the first time since the Napoleonic Wars that an enemy army had been stationed on Prussia's eastern border, and the fact had a symbolic weight that neither the German command nor the population could ignore. The Soviet plan for the region envisaged a coordinated operation between 3 different fronts. The First Baltic Front, under the command of General Ivan Bagramian, was to press from the north towards the Niemen River and the Baltic coast, with the aim of severing the connection between the German Army Group North in the Baltic states and the forces in East Prussia. Cherniakhovsky's Third Belarusian Front was tasked with penetrating the German defences along the Gumbinnen-Insterburg-Königsberg axis, the main communications axis for the entire province, advancing directly into the city from the east. The Second Belarusian Front, under the command of Konstantin Rokossovsky, the commander who had led the encirclement of Stalingrad from the north, was to envelop East Prussia from the south and cut off the land connection between the province and the rest of Germany, while protecting the southern flank from Georgy Zhukov's main advance towards Berlin from Poland. It was, from its conception, an operation designed not only to conquer the province, but to completely isolate it, turning its defenders into a pocket with no possibility of retreat. The first phase of this plan, Operation Gumbinnen-Goldap, was launched on October 16, 1944, with the 5th and 11th Guards of the Army spearheading Cherniakhovsky's advance. In the first days, the attack managed to penetrate several kilometers into East Prussian territory, reaching and surpassing Gumbinnen, one of the main urban centers of the eastern region of the province. The German 4th Panzer Division and other units of Army Group Center tried to contain the advance with the means available, but the superiority of Soviet forces in that sector, both in infantry and armor and tactical air support, meant that containment was partial during the first few days. The German counter-offensive that finally succeeded in halting the Soviet advance and pushing Red Army units back to their starting positions was not a strategic planning success. It was the result of hastily concentrating armoured divisions brought in from other sectors of the front, and in a process that left those other sectors without the reserves they would have needed in the weeks and months that followed. The German Fourth Army, which held the line east of Königsberg, and the Third Panzer Army, responsible for the northern sector of East Prussia, had managed to halt the October advance at considerable cost in material and manpower that could not be replenished before the next major offensive. Every panzer division moved to East Prussia to stop Cherniakhovsky in October was a missing panzer division in the Warsaw sector when Zhukov and Rokossovsky broke the front in January. The first offensive on German soil failed in its objective of decisive breakthrough, but he left something that would change the course of the entire campaign. For the first time since 1941, Soviet troops had occupied, albeit briefly, German villages. And what happened in one of those villages during that transitory occupation would become a harbinger, a warning and propaganda material for months to come. Nemmersdorf was a small village, one of many that dotted the rural landscape of East Prussia, with no particular strategic importance beyond being on the route of the Soviet advance of October 1944. It was briefly occupied by Red Army troops and recaptured days later by a German counter-offensive. What the German troops found when they reoccupied the village became, almost immediately, one of the images most used by the propaganda of the Nazi regime during the following months. Civilians killed, homes looted, a pattern of violence against the population that Goebbels' propaganda services disseminated with photographs and reports aimed at sowing terror and, with him, the will to resist until the end. Historians have debated for decades the exact extent of what happened at Nemmersdorf, in part because Nazi propaganda deliberately exaggerated certain details to maximize its political effect. But the core of the fact that German civilians were killed by Soviet troops during that brief occupation is not disputed among serious historians of the period, and is documented both in German sources of the time and in later research on the conduct of the Red Army in its westward advance. What Nemmersdorf represented beyond the specific facts was a psychological breakdown. Until October 1944, a large part of the population of East Prussia retained the hope that the war would somehow not reach their gates, or that if it did, it would end with a more or less orderly occupation. After Nemmersdorf, that hope collapsed. Local authorities and the military command used the event to justify the refusal to authorize early evacuations of the civilian population, arguing that fleeing was a sign of weakness and that military defense would protect those who remained. That decision, made in the months after Nemmersdorf, would have devastating consequences when the Soviet offensive of January 1945 devastated the region without the majority of the civilian population having had time to escape. 5. The collapse of the front, January 1945. The Great Soviet Winter Offensive began on January 12, 1945, when Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front broke through the German defences in the Vistula sector north of Krakow. On January 14th, Zhukov's First Belarusian Front did the same from the Magnusiu bridgehead south of Warsaw, and on January 14th, in perfect coordination with the advance in central Poland, Chernyakhovsky's Third Belarusian Front and Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front simultaneously launched their respective offensives against German positions in East Prussia, in what Soviet planners called the East Prussian Operation, one of the most complex of the entire winter offensive of 1945. The difference with the October operation was of absolute scale. Where the Gumbin and Goldap operation had employed 2 Guards armies with limited armoured support, the January offensive deployed resources from 2 full fronts. The Third Belarusian Front had 5 rifle armies, 2 armoured Guards armies, and massive artillery support units concentrated in densities of up to 200 pieces per kilometre of front on the main attack axis. The Second Belarusian Front, which was to execute the enveloping movement from the south, had equivalent means and a superiority in armoured vehicles over the German forces it faced, which the German records of the time put at proportions of 5 or 6 to 1 in the breakout sectors. The German Fourth Army, which held the positions east of Königsberg under the command of General Friedrich Hossbach, suffered losses in the first hours of the attack on the 14th of January that disorganized its lines of communication and called into question the coherence of its entire defensive disposition. Hossbach ordered a retreat to the west in an attempt to avoid encirclement, a decision that contradicted Hitler's direct orders to hold out in assigned positions and which would later trigger his removal from command. The retreat, although militarily logical, was executed under conditions of increasing disorganization, with units losing contact with each other and with the command, and with the withdrawal routes already under pressure from Soviet armor advancing north from the Rokossovsky sector. Rokossovsky's plan was the most ambitious element of the entire operation. His Second Belarusian Front was to advance northwards from its positions in northern Poland, crossing the Narew River and the Masovian region, to reach the Baltic coast near Elbing and Danzig, thus completing the total isolation of East Prussia from the rest of German territory. It was an enveloping movement of proportions that military history compares to the great maneuvers of Hannibal or Schlieffen, and which in practice was executed with a speed that exceeded even the most optimistic forecasts of the Soviet General Staff itself. By 26th of January 1945, just 12 days after the start of the offensive, the forward units of the Second Belarusian Front reached the Baltic coast in the Elbing sector. East Prussia was completely separated by land from the rest of the Reich. The German Third Panzer Army, under the command of General Erhard Rauss, which had attempted to maintain a coherent line of defence north of the Rokossovsky breakout sector, was thus pocketed along with the bulk of the Fourth Army in a pocket covering the entire territory of East Prussia east of the new Soviet line. The options available to these armies were reduced to 3 to attempt to break the encirclement to the west in an attack that required concentrating forces that were no longer available, to retreat to Königsberg and the coastal positions in the hope of eventually evacuating by sea, or to hold out in position until a German relief offensive, which no one in the German command had the means to organize anymore, will succeed in re-establishing the land link. In practice, the first option disappeared in a matter of days, and the combination of the second and third was imposed by default on all German commanders trapped in the region, regardless of what they thought about their real chances of success. The speed of the collapse also hit the civil administration of the province. Gauleiter Erich Koch, who for months had blocked or delayed civilian evacuation orders, arguing that allowing them would damage the morale of the rear, and would be tantamount to acknowledging that the military situation was desperate, belatedly ordered the evacuation of the eastern districts of the province when the front had already been broken and the Soviet armored columns were advancing faster than the columns of civilian refugees trying to flee to the west. The result was chaos of biblical proportions. Columns of civilians stuck on snowy roads, crisscrossed by retreating military units, in temperatures of several degrees below zero and with Soviet aircraft attacking traffic jams from the air. By the end of January 1945, Königsberg had been effectively surrounded, not yet completely isolated. There was a narrow land corridor to the west toward the port of Pillau, which German forces managed to keep open intermittently through constant fighting, but it had become a besieged city in the most literal sense of the term, surrounded on three sides by Soviet forces and with its only escape route reduced to a corridor a few kilometers wide, under almost permanent artillery fire. The city was not, however, an easy target. Since the 19th century, Prussian military planners had built around Königsberg a defensive system designed to withstand precisely a prolonged siege. 15 forts of brick and reinforced concrete arranged in an outer ring several kilometers from the urban center, each designed to support garrisons of several hundred men with their own artillery. To this first ring was added a second belt of fortifications, closer to the urban centre, built and modernized during the interwar period with reinforced concrete bunkers capable of withstanding field artillery fire. Command of the square fell to Infantry General Otto Lasch, a career officer who had served on the Eastern Front since the start of the campaign against the Soviet Union in 1941. Lasch inherited a garrison made up of the remnants of several divisions decimated in the January fighting, reinforced with units of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia formed in October 1944 on Hitler's direct orders, which recruited men between the ages of 16 and 60 who were not previously fit or mobilized for regular military service, and with administrative and police personnel hastily converted into combat troops. The quality of these forces was enormously uneven. While some regular army units maintained discipline and combat capability despite attrition, the Volkssturm's battalions were largely made up of teenagers with no serious military training and middle-aged or older men, many of them World War I veterans who had not wielded a weapon for more than 2 decades. The weaponry available to these units was equally precarious. Obsolete rifles, chronic shortages of ammunition, and in some cases, according to records from the time, units sent to the front with barely the minimum training to load and fire their weapons. Added to this heterogeneous military force was a civilian population that, despite evacuation orders issued weeks earlier, still numbered hundreds of thousands inside the city by the time the siege was completely closed. Many had not managed to leave in time. Others had refused to do so, either because of official propaganda promising that the city would resist or because of the simple logistical impossibility of moving so many people with the means of transport available in the middle of winter. Joseph Goebbels had conceived of Kolberg as the centerpiece of the propaganda campaign aimed at psychologically preparing the Germans for the final phase of the war. The project began in 1942, when the war could still be presented as a series of victories, and the film was finished in 1944 with the Eastern Front already collapsing to the west. Directed by Veit Harlan, the same director who had shot the anti-Semitic film Judd Seuss in 1940, Kolberg was the most expensive production in German cinema up to that time. It cost more than 8 million Reichsmarks, employed thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers summoned from the front as extras, in a gesture of priorities that says a lot about the logic of the regime in its last hours, and shot battle sequences in real locations with military personnel and equipment that in January 1945 would have been infinitely more useful on the Eastern Front than on a movie set. The story told by the film is based on real events. In 1806 and 1807, while Frederick William III's Prussian army was being torn apart by Napoleon in the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, the fortress city of Kolberg on the Pomeranian coast of the Baltic withstood a prolonged siege by French forces. The defense was led by Lieutenant Colonel August von Gneisenau, the regular officer commanding the garrison, in combination with the local Burgomaster Joachim Nettelbeck, who organized the participation of the civilian population in the defense. The city held out until peace treaties formally ended the conflict, and its resistance was used for decades by Prussian historiography as an example of German civic and military courage in the face of Napoleonic oppression. Harlan's film presents this story with all the resources of the propaganda cinema of the time: grandiose images, an explicit message about the will to resist as the supreme virtue of the German people, and a reading of the historical episode carefully selected to reinforce the slogans of the regime in the winter of 1944 to 1945. Goebbels ordered the film to be released simultaneously in 2 locations: in Berlin at the Ufer Palace on January 30th, 1945, the date deliberately chosen, the 12th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, and in the city of La Rochelle in France, then besieged by the Allied forces and whose German garrison continued to resist as part of the so-called shield ports that Hitler had ordered to maintain at all costs. The gesture had a specific propaganda logic: to demonstrate that the besieged cities could resist, and that Kohlberg's historical example was applicable to the present situation. To ensure that the message reached the besieged garrisons in the east, Goebbels ordered copies of the film to be flown to various German cities under siege, including Königsberg, where it was screened for both the troops and the civilian population who remained in the city, in cinemas that were powered by emergency generators because the regular electricity supply was already intermittent. The implicit message that the film was meant to convey to viewers in Königsberg was straightforward. The inhabitants of Kohlberg had resisted against Napoleon when all seemed lost, and they had survived. The inhabitants of Königsberg were to do the same against the Red Army. The historical parallelism that the film was intended to draw was, however, deeply misleading on several simultaneous levels. First, the historic Kohlberg of 1807 did not hold out because it changed the outcome of the war. Prussia had been militarily defeated before the siege began, but because the terms of the peace treaty that ended the conflict allowed it to keep its garrison. Second, the war between Prussia and Napoleonic France, brutal as it was in many respects, was a war between European states that retained certain conventions on the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. The war which Germany had launched against the Soviet Union in 1941 had been, from its conception, a war of racial and political extermination, the methods of which, the systematic murder of Soviet prisoners of war, the deliberate starvation as a weapon against the civilian population of the occupied cities, the extermination of the Jewish population, had generated among the Soviet troops a mixture of hatred and desire for revenge that no parallel with the Napoleonic Wars could have seen. Attenuate or contextualize. Third, and more prosaically, the garrison at Königsberg in 1945 had no peace treaty in sight that would allow it to wait with hope. The only thing it hoped for on the other side of the final assault was unconditional defeat. For the inhabitants who remained in Königsberg during the winter and spring of 1945, daily life became unrecognizable in a matter of weeks from what it had been just months before. The food supply, already subject to the strict rationing that the regime had imposed on Germany since the early years of the war, became critical once the Soviet encirclement cut off most supply routes. Official rations, which at the height of the encirclement period could include a minimum amount of bread and preserves distributed through supply points organized by the military authorities, were progressively reduced as the weeks went by, and resupply by air was insufficient for a city with tens of thousands of mouths to feed. The Dr. Hans Graf von Lehndorff, who practiced in the hospitals of Königsberg during the siege and left a detailed diary of those months published decades later, describes in his notes the progressive appearance of symptoms of malnutrition among the civilian population, especially in the most vulnerable segments, young children and the elderly, for whom the available rations were insufficient to maintain an acceptable nutritional minimum. The city's hospitals were operating under pressure that exceeded any health planning forecast for a siege situation. The main civilian hospital in Königsberg, along with several makeshift military hospitals in requisitioned buildings, received military casualties. Surgical instruments were progressively depleted without the possibility of resupply. Lehndorff describes in his diaries surgical interventions performed under insufficient anesthesia because there was no more available, amputations performed under aseptic conditions far below the minimum necessary, and rooms where the wounded occupied every inch of available horizontal space, including corridors and stairs. There is a particularly revealing entry in that diary of the sanitary conditions of the period. It describes how doctors had to make triage decisions that in normal times would have been unthinkable, ruling out the care of wounded whose injuries were considered too serious to justify the use of the scarce resources available in a situation where other patients with minor injuries were more likely to survive. Electrical power was running increasingly irregularly, relying on fuel-consuming emergency generators at a time when all available fuel was a priority for military use. In much of the city, the supply of running water became unreliable as pumping infrastructure suffered the accumulated damage of months of shelling. Heating, in a winter that weather records at the time describe as particularly severe, with temperatures frequently dropping below 10 degrees below zero, depended on the coal and firewood available in each building, and for many residents meant in practice concentrating in 1 or 2 rooms on the lowest floor of the building, closing the rest to conserve the minimum heat generated by a small emergency stove. The basements of the apartment buildings became the permanent place of residence for many families who came down from their flats for good as the Soviet artillery bombardments on the defensive perimeter of the city intensified and made it increasingly dangerous to stay on the upper floors. The civilian population that remained in the city was composed by early 1945 mostly women, children, and the elderly. Men of military age, between 16 and 60 years old by the criteria of the Volkssturm, had been mobilized almost in their entirety. Those who did not fight at the front worked in roles of logistical support, construction of defensive positions, or maintenance of essential services. That meant that the burden of daily life under siege, getting food, caring for the wounded, keeping shelters running, caring for children and the elderly, fell almost exclusively on the adult women of the city in conditions that had no precedent in the life experience of any of them. The local government, headed by Gauleiter Erich Koch, maintained for weeks a policy of public communication that did not correspond to the military reality. Koch had ruled East Prussia with a heavy hand since his appointment in 1933, applying the regime's policies with a rigidity that his own subordinates described as extreme even by the standards of Nazism. During the months of siege, his official communiqué combined exhortations to resistance with the implicit promise that the military situation would improve, that reinforcements would arrive, that the Führer would not abandon East Prussia. When Koch left the city in the days leading up to the final assault, traveling west by boat from Pillau, many of the survivors who documented their memories after the war remembered that abandonment as the clearest sign that the authorities knew long before that the situation was irreversible. The only escape route that kept Königsberg connected to the rest of unoccupied East Prussia was the narrow land corridor to the port of Pillau on the Samland Peninsula, about 30 kilometers west of the city. This corridor, constantly disputed by both sides, became the vital artery through which both attempts to reinforce the military to the besieged city and attempts to evacuate civilians and wounded to the coast flowed, from where the German Navy organized a massive maritime evacuation to the ports of Western Germany. This maritime evacuation, collectively known as Operation Hannibal, would become one of the largest naval evacuations of civilians in history, with hundreds of thousands of people transported from the ports of East Prussia and Pomerania westward aboard warships, merchant ships, and vessels of all types, in extremely crowded conditions and under constant threat of Soviet submarine and air attacks. The sinking of the liner Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30, 1945, off the coast of Pomerania, with several thousand refugees on board, would become the deadliest maritime disaster in history. and a brutal reminder that even flight by sea did not guarantee survival. For those who remained in Königsberg, access to that corridor and to maritime evacuation depended entirely on German troops managing to keep it open, something that became increasingly difficult as Soviet pressure on the Samland Peninsula intensified. The German army fought between 19 and 24 February 1945, a specific offensive to re-establish and secure this land link between Königsberg and Pillau in one of the last significant offensive efforts that German forces in the region would be able to sustain. The operation achieved its immediate objective, but the corridor never ceased to be under fire, and its control remained disputed practically until the day the city fell. As the military front stabilized precariously around Königsberg in February 1945, one of the best documented episodes of violence against the civilian population of the entire East Prussian campaign occurred in the immediate rear of the city. Mettgarten, a suburb west of Königsberg, was occupied by Soviet troops between 29th January and 19th February 1945, and later recaptured by the German 5th Panzer Division and the 1st Infantry Division, as part of the offensive to re-establish the corridor to Pillau. What the German troops found when they reoccupied the area was recorded in a series of affidavits taken in the days and weeks that followed, today preserved in the German Federal Archive. These testimonies, given by soldiers, officers, and a military doctor, described the discovery of a large number of dead civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, since the male population of military age had already been mobilized or had fled weeks earlier, as well as the bodies of German soldiers and refugees who had been trapped in the area when the Soviet front advanced in January. General Otto Lasch, upon receiving the first reports from the units that reoccupied Mettgarten, ordered the formation of an investigative commission composed of forensic doctors, officers, and foreign journalists, with the aim of documenting what happened and establishing the identity of the victims. The work of that commission, according to preserved testimonies, was hindered because some of the evidence had been deliberately altered prior to the recovery of the area. Even so, the commission managed to photograph and catalogue much of what was found, documentation that was later used both to interrogate Soviet prisoners of war captured in other sectors of the front and to try to identify civilian victims to their families. Among the testimonies collected by the Commission and preserved in the archive is that of the Dr. Hans Graf von Lehndorff, who practiced in Königsberg during those months and who documented in his personal diary episodes of systematic violence against the civilian population during the periods of Soviet occupation of different areas of the city and its surroundings. What happened in Mettgarten was not, according to all this documentation, an isolated event. It was part of a pattern of violence against German civilians that was repeated, with variations in intensity, in numerous towns in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia during the Soviet advance in the first months of 1945, a phenomenon documented more extensively by researchers such as Alfred Maurice de Zayas in his studies on the fate of the East German civilian population during the end of the war and the years immediately after. The Nazi regime used what happened in Mettgarten, as it had done months earlier with Nemmersdorf, as propaganda material aimed at sustaining the population's will to resist. Pamphlets describing the events were distributed to the city's civilian population, with the explicit aim of convincing those who still doubted that surrender was not a safe alternative, but a condemnation. The effect of this propaganda, real or exaggerated in its details as the case may be, was to deepen the terror of a population that no longer had anywhere to flee, and that was preparing, without yet knowing it with certainty, for the final assault that would come in April. Are the hundreds of thousands of East Prussian civilians trying to escape westward during the winter of 1945? One of the main escape routes was the lagoon known as Frisches Haff, today's Lake Vistula, a shallow expanse of water separated from the Baltic Sea by a narrow strip of sand, which in the winter months froze enough to allow columns of refugees to pass through to the Baltic Sea. foot, and in horse-drawn carts. The crossing on the ice became one of the most persistent images in the collective memory of those expelled from East Prussia. Columns of civilians, laden with what little they could carry, advanced for hours on an icy surface whose resistance varied according to the temperature of the previous days, under a cold that records of the time describe as exceptionally severe even for Baltic winters. The paradox was obvious to those who lived through those days. The lower the temperature, the thicker and safer the ice sheet became, so that the same cold that threatened to kill those who crossed with hypothermia was, at the same time, the only guarantee that the ice would withstand the weight of the columns. Soviet aircraft repeatedly bombed these columns of refugees, attacking both the mass of moving civilians and at times directly the icy surface, with the aim of breaking it under the weight of those who crossed it. The human losses on these journeys could never be accurately quantified, given the chaotic nature of the exodus and the impossibility of keeping a systematic record of who attempted the crossing. But historical estimates agree that thousands of people died in the attempt, either drowning when the ice gave way under the weight of the carts, frozen during the march, or direct victims of airstrikes. Those who managed to complete the crossing reached the narrow strip of land that separated the lagoon from the open sea, from where they tried to continue westwards, either on foot along the coast or waiting for the possibility of embarking on one of the ships participating in the maritime evacuation organized from the ports of the region. For many, however, that final leg of the journey became a new test of endurance, in columns that advanced for days in sub-zero temperatures, with little food and no guarantee that the port they were heading to would still be accessible by the time they arrived. By the end of March 1945, Königsberg had been in a relative calm for weeks that everyone involved knew to be artificial. The Soviet command, with its main resources committed to the offensive on Berlin that Zhukov and Konev were preparing in Poland, had kept the city under siege without yet launching the final attack, taking advantage of the time to concentrate the artillery and aviation necessary to guarantee a quick victory when the time came. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, who had assumed command of the Third Belarusian Front on February 20, 1945, after the death of Chernyakhovsky, led this preparation with the meticulousness that characterized one of the most respected Soviet military leaders of the period. Vasilevsky had been the chief planner of Operation Uranus, the siege of Stalingrad in November 1942, and other complex operations on the Eastern Front, and he applied to the assault on Königsberg the same methodological approach that had characterized his work throughout the war. Extensive preparation, detailed coordination between arms, and speed of execution once the attack had begun. The resources gathered for the final assault are indicative of the priority that the Soviet command gave to the rapid reduction of the city. According to the historical records of the operation, Vasilevsky concentrated for the attack more than 137,000 infantrymen, 2,300 pieces of artillery and mortars, 538 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 500 fighter planes of different types distributed among tactical bombers, fighter bombers, and escort fighters. The whole represented a proportion of forces that later military analyses place between 4 and 5 times higher in numbers and between 8 and 10 times greater in artillery than the German garrison available for defense. It was not a force designed for a prolonged assault. It was a force designed to crush the city's defenses in the shortest possible time and with the minimum of Soviet casualties. The preparation of the terrain included weeks of intensive aerial reconnaissance over the defensive positions of the German garrison. Aerial photography, combined with information obtained from prisoners captured during the previous fighting and from deserters who had crossed the lines in the last days of the siege, allowed the Soviet command to construct a detailed picture of the German defensive disposition, the exact location of the forts on the outer ring, the minefields laid at the approaches to the city, the artillery concentration points, the internal communication routes of the garrison, and the areas where the urban fabric was denser and therefore house-to-house combat predictably more costly in terms of casualties. General Otto Lasch, for his part, spent those same weeks of March organizing the defense with resources that dwindled day by day. Communications between the different sectors of the defensive perimeter depended on a field telephone network laid between the positions, exposed to the cuts caused by the bombardments and which the technical personnel of the garrison repaired tirelessly. Ammunition supplies, one of the most critical factors for the duration of any defense, arrived irregularly through the Pillau corridor, which the Soviets were constantly pressuring to close completely before the final assault. The armored vehicles available for defense, a small number of tanks and self-propelled guns distributed among the various sectors of the perimeter, had to be reserved for emergency situations because the available fuel did not allow them to be deployed freely. General Lash's conversations with his staff during those final weeks, partially reconstructed from the memoirs that Lash himself wrote after the war from his status as a Soviet prisoner and which he published in 1958 under the title So Faithful Königsberg, reflect the clear awareness he had of the impossibility of resisting indefinitely against a force of the magnitude that recognition indicated to him that it was accumulating in front of its positions. The options available to the garrison were, in practice, reduced to two: to resist to the last man on Hitler's orders, which meant prolonging the suffering of civilians and soldiers without any possibility of altering the final outcome, or to capitulate when the military situation was clearly untenable, which meant disobeying a direct order from the Supreme Commander and facing the personal consequences that this entailed. Lash chose, when the time came, the second option. But in those last weeks of March, with the assault not yet launched, the orders still in force and the regime still able to carry out its threats, that choice was not yet possible. In the days immediately prior to the start of the assault, the Soviet command completed the deployment of concentrated artillery for the initial bombardment. Pieces of different calibers, from field artillery to heavy howitzers, capable of penetrating the reinforced concrete fortifications of the outer defensive ring, were positioned in an arc that surrounded the city to the east, the south and the north, leaving as the only theoretically open route the corridor to Pillau, already under heavy Soviet military pressure on the Samland Peninsula. Soviet aircraft, for their part, intensified reconnaissance flights over the city in the days leading up to the attack, photographing defensive positions, troop concentrations, and points of resistance identified over months of siege, information that was incorporated into the final bombing plan to maximize the effectiveness of the first strikes against the better fortified German positions. Inside the city, the last days of March and the first days of April passed in a tense calm that contrasted with the general certainty, both among the troops and among the civilian population, that the final attack was a matter of days. General Lash, in his communications with the High Command, repeatedly warned about the unsustainability of the position in the medium term, without these warnings modifying in any way the orders received from Berlin, where Hitler maintained the demand for total resistance as an immovable principle, regardless of the real conditions on the ground or the human cost that such resistance implied for a city that, at this point in the war, it no longer had any realistic chance of altering the final outcome of the conflict. 14. April 6th. The assault begins. At 9 o'clock in the morning of April 6, 1945, Soviet artillery concentrated around Königsberg opened fire simultaneously on the entire defensive perimeter of the city. It was the beginning of a saturation bombardment that would continue, with varying intensities, for the next 4 days, combining ground artillery fire with tactical air attacks directed against the positions identified in the previous weeks of reconnaissance. The initial target of the attack was the outer ring forts, the brick and concrete fortifications built decades earlier that constituted the city's first line of organized defense. Soviet heavy artillery, with pieces capable of penetrating the reinforced concrete of older structures, subjected these positions to sustained punishment as infantry advanced under cover into the gaps that were opening up in the German defensive perimeter. German resistance, despite the disproportion of forces, was initially stronger than the Soviet command had anticipated in some sectors, particularly where the regular army units, better trained and equipped than the Volkssturm battalions, managed to hold organized positions during the first hours of the attack. However, the lack of reserves and the impossibility of resupplying ammunition and reinforcements to the positions under siege meant that this initial resistance was, from day one, a matter of time rather than of the final result. By the end of the first day of fighting, several positions on the outer ring had fallen or were about to fall, and Soviet troops had begun to penetrate the city's outlying quarters, initiating what would become in the following days street-by-street urban combat, characteristic of the assaults on fortified cities that the Red Army had perfected throughout the war from Stalingrad. During 7 and 8 April, the combat progressively moved from the outer defensive ring to the interior of the city itself, transforming into a street-by-street and, in many cases, building-by-building fight, in which the Soviet numerical and equipment advantage was combined with a detailed knowledge of the urban terrain acquired during months of observation and reconnaissance prior to the assault. Soviet troops advanced from multiple directions simultaneously, according to the original plan to split the city into isolated sectors that could be reduced separately. This tactic prevented the German command, already with lines of communication severely damaged by continuous bombardment, from being able to coordinate a unified defense or effectively redistribute the scarce resources available among the various sectors under attack. The city's historic center, already damaged by British aerial bombardments in August 1944, suffered further destruction during these days of fighting, with much of what was left standing of medieval and 19th century structures reduced to rubble by direct artillery fire and house-to-house fighting. The civilian population that remained in the city, sheltering in basements and makeshift bunkers, lived these 2 days under practically constant bombardment, with increasingly limited access to food, drinking water and medical care for the wounded, in a context in which the city's hospitals were already operating well above their capacity. For General Lasch, the situation towards the end of April 8th was, in military terms, untenable. The garrison had suffered massive casualties during the 3 days of fighting. The defensive positions had been reduced to a fraction of the original perimeter, and communications between the various sectors of the city were barely functioning. Despite this, the orders received from the High Command continued to demand resistance without capitulation, leaving Lasch before a decision that he would have to make in the following hours, in open contradiction with Hitler's explicit directives. On the morning of April 9, 1945, after 3 full days of uninterrupted combat and with the German garrison reduced to a fraction of its original strength, General Otto Lasch made the decision to surrender the Königsberg Square, formally communicating the capitulation to the Soviet command in the following hours. It was a decision made against the direct orders of Hitler, who had demanded resistance to the last man, and which Lasch himself knew would have serious personal consequences. The casualty figures for the battle, according to Soviet estimates released at the time, spoke of approximately 32,000 German soldiers killed during the final fighting, and a considerably larger number of captured prisoners, a figure that included both regular military personnel and members of Volkssturm units, who had fought in conditions of almost total inferiority to Soviet forces. Civilian casualties, much more difficult to quantify accurately given the chaotic nature of urban fighting and the impossibility of keeping systematic records in a city under siege, added to a human cost that later historiography was never able to establish with absolute accuracy, although available estimates agree that it was considerable. Hitler, upon receiving news of the surrender, sentenced Lasch to death in absentia, a sentence that in practice could never be carried out since Lasch was immediately taken into Soviet custody as a prisoner of war. Hitler's reaction reflected the logic of the regime in its final weeks of existence, the insistence on total resistance as an absolute principle, regardless of any rational military considerations or the human cost that such insistence implied, a logic that would be repeated in the following weeks on other fronts as the Third Reich collapsed for good. The fall of Königsberg on April 9th did not mean an immediate end to the fighting in the region. The remnants of the German 3rd Panzer Army, along with other scattered units that had managed to retreat westward during the days of the assault on the city, were concentrated on the Samland Peninsula northwest of Königsberg, where they maintained organized resistance for an additional little more than 2 weeks. The Soviet command, now in control of Königsberg consolidated, directed its resources towards reducing this last pocket of German resistance in East Prussia in an operation that lasted from the 13th to the 25th of April 1945. The conditions for the German forces trapped in Samland were, if possible, even more desperate than those they had faced in Königsberg, with no possibility of reinforcement, with supplies practically exhausted, and with the only evacuation route reduced to the port of Pillau, subjected to constant bombardment. The only possible result of the resistance on the peninsula was to prolong the number of casualties without altering the final outcome. By 25th April 1945, German organized resistance on the Samland Peninsula had been completely liquidated, marking the effective end of East Prussia's military campaign, one of the longest and costliest on the entire Eastern Front in the final phase of the war, formally begun in October 1944 with the Gumbinnen-Goldap offensive and concluded 6 months later with the surrender of the last German strongholds on the Baltic coast, just 2 weeks before Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. 18. A city without Germans. The fall of Königsberg and the liquidation of the resistance in Samland did not put an end to the tragedy of the civilian population of East Prussia. In many ways, they initiated it in its final form. Those who had survived the siege, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were left under Soviet military administration in a city with no functional infrastructure, severe food shortages, and no clear legal guarantees about their future situation. The months immediately following the surrender were, for much of this population, a period of precarious survival in the midst of the ruins of what had been their city. The decision on the final fate of East Prussia had actually been made before the war had even ended. At the Yalta Conference, held in February 1945, while the fighting for Königsberg had not yet begun, the Allied leaders, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, had already discussed the westward shift of Poland's eastern border, which implied in return the annexation of German territory to the east by the Soviet Union and Poland. The Potsdam Conference, held between July and August 1945 with the war already over, confirmed and formalized these decisions. Northern East Prussia, including Königsberg, would become part of the Soviet Union, while the south of the province would be integrated into Poland. These territorial decisions implied another, equally decisive for the fate of the German population in the region: their systematic expulsion to the west. What had begun as a chaotic and desperate exodus during the final months of the war, the escape on the ice of the Frisches Haff, the maritime evacuation of Operation Hannibal, the columns of refugees bombed on the roads of East Prussia, became, in the years that followed, a deliberate policy of forcible population transfer, carried out with different degrees of organization and violence depending on the region and period, and which constituted one of the largest forced population displacements in the European history of the 20th century. The German population that still remained in and around Königsberg after the surrender of April 1945 was not immediately expelled in its entirety. During the first months of Soviet administration, a part of that population was retained for reconstruction and rubble-clearing work in extremely harsh living conditions, with chronic food shortages that caused, according to available records, a considerable number of deaths from hunger and disease during the winter of 1945 to 1946 in a city that barely had functional health infrastructure. The definitive change in the city's status came in 1946, when the Soviet authorities formalized its annexation to the territory of the Soviet Union and officially renamed it Kaliningrad in honor of Mikhail Kalinin, then chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, who died that same year. The name Königsberg, which the city had carried for almost 700 years, disappeared from maps and official documents, replaced by a name that bore no relation to the previous history of the place. The systematic expulsion of the remaining German population intensified between 1947 and 1948 as part of a policy of population transfer to the Allied occupation zones in Germany that, broadly speaking, applied to all the territories east of the Oder-Neisse line that passed to Polish or Soviet sovereignty after the war. By 1948, virtually the entire German population, historically settled in what had been East Prussia, had been resettled westward, in many cases under extremely precarious conditions, while the region was repopulated with settlers from different parts of the Soviet Union, particularly Russia. The Kaliningrad that exists today is, in that sense, a city built on the deliberate absence of its German past. The royal castle, damaged during the war but still recoverable, was demolished on the orders of Soviet authorities in 1968, in a gesture that many historians interpret as an explicit attempt to physically erase any visible vestiges of the city's Prussian identity. The tomb of Immanuel Kant, however, survived, preserved alongside the north wall of what remained of the cathedral, becoming over time one of the few recognizable points of continuity between the Königsberg it once was and the Kaliningrad it is today. 700 years of German history in East Prussia ended in practical terms in the course of a few months between the winter of 1944 and the summer of 1948. The Battle of Königsberg, with its 4 days of final assault in April 1945, was just the culmination of a military campaign that had lasted for half a year, and which in turn was only the prelude to a process of forced displacement that completely redefined the ethnic and political map of a region that for centuries had been a border and bridge between worlds. The city that gave the world to Immanuel Kant, which housed for almost 400 years one of the most important universities in Central Europe, which was the cradle of philosophers, composers and artists, ceased to exist under that name in 1945, and with it also disappeared to a large extent the human community that had inhabited it for generations, worked and defended. What came next? The Soviet military enclave cut off from the rest of Russian territory by Lithuania and Poland, Kaliningrad closed to the outside world for much of the Cold War, the region that today combines Prussian vestiges with post-war Soviet architecture, is ultimately the long shadow of those days in April 1945. When one of the oldest cities in Central Europe ceased to belong to the history that had built it and began to belong irreversibly to a completely different one,